There is no doubt that World War II was the greatest global conflict in all of human history. Apart from involving conflicts in various parts of the world with the lives of tens of millions of combatants and civilians alike, it included some of the greatest military operations in modern history. It was a period marked by many innovations and the introduction of many new technologies to the battlefields, in addition to complex plans and sometimes even exaggerated in complexity. Although many of the plans that were implemented in the Second World War were already very strange and complex, they were simpler and less surprising than many of the plans that were drawn on paper but never implemented, either because they were not possible at all or because they were not needed in changing the conditions required before they were implemented. In this list, we will address some of the strangest plans formulated and drawn up by Allied forces, the Soviets as well as Britain, France and the United States, or Axis powers, Germany, Japan, and Italy. Operation Bernhard, Nazi scheme to counter the British currency. Before the US dollar became the world currency used between countries and is the most powerful currency in the world, it was the title of the British pound, which is the British currency, and the most common currency in the world at the time thanks to the empire, which is not absent by the sun and extending on all continents of the world without exception Australia to North America. This great value of the British currency has caused a Nazi scheme as very ambitious, involving the forging of British banknotes in very large quantities and then sent to flood the British market with money. The purpose of this dumping is to cause inflation, the rise in the price of goods, and thus greatly weaken the British economy and even cause popular unrest, undermine the great British power. The first part of the process was to print money, of course. To that end, the Nazis collected their best experts in the field, and even volunteered some Jewish specialists who had taken them out of concentration camps. Things went well at first when the Nazis printed almost £1 million, with inflation equal to about 60 million, today on a monthly basis over the years of the war. However, the second part of the plan was not as successful as the first part. Although the Nazis managed to print money in large quantities, they could not easily put it into Britain. On the one hand, even if they succeeded in bringing it into the millions, and so the money had to be used for other purposes. That is what the Nazis actually did. They used counterfeit money to pay money to other governments, especially Italy, and they used it to pay their spies around the world. It is interesting here that one of the Nazi spies is of Turkish nationality. The first to sue the German government after the war because it gave him false money, but his attempt failed and did not get any compensation. Operation Tannenbaum. Nazi plot to invade Switzerland. If you look at the map in front of you, which represents the Third Reich, the Third German Empire or the Nazi period, you will notice a strange thing. Although the Germans had control of most parts of the European continent, there is a white place in the middle that is not subject to the Germans. This place is Switzerland, which remained neutral during the entire World War II, avoiding alignment with the Axis countries or with the Allies, and although neutrality was not impressed by either party, each side sees the world from the point of view. If you are not with me, you are against me. She managed to maintain her independence and the Nazi leader Adolf Hitler was not really impressed with Switzerland. With his fascist regime and extreme views, a neutral force within his empire was like an enemy in the middle, stating Hitler to Mussolini, the Italian fascist leader. Switzerland has the most hated and most unhappy people and political system, and the Swiss are the eternal enemy of the new Germany. So after the fall of France in 1940, began planning and equipment for a complete invasion of Switzerland and its political system, and includes it to the German Empire by force. But this invasion never happened during the years of war. There is no specific reason to stop the invasion scheme, but there are many factors that made it impossible on the one hand, and useless on the other. They refused to receive any Jews or other refugees fleeing from Nazi oppression, and even allowed the Germans to use Swiss railways for easier and quicker access to Allied Italian territory. Switzerland is a large part of the Alpine chain and has a very rugged nature, and its cities are largely geographically protected. With the Germans preoccupied with the Eastern Front against the Soviets, the Swiss have equipped a military force of the almost 500,000 well-equipped and experienced people in the region. The attempted invasion was a flawed failure, with negative effects on the Germans and anti-Swiss sentiment. Dub Project. Use the bathroom as a better missile guidance system. If you have not heard of the world before, B.F. Skinner, a quick search on Google will quickly emerge as one of the most important behavioral scientists in history, thanks to the many important discoveries that were used later in many researches and games. However, Skinner's most famous experiments were his ability to demonstrate the learning and adaptability of animals, especially pigeons, which he conducted many experiments. He showed his ability to teach certain behaviors and to avoid others. During the Second World War, missile weapons, especially long-range missiles, lacked any level of precision. They lacked the modern guidance systems. Skinner suggested that the U.S. Army use the pre-trained bathroom to direct missile warheads and so on possibilities have a higher goal injury than before. The plan included placing one or more pigeons in front of a screen displaying a central view of the intended target, and once the target is out of the screen, the pigeons click a specific button to return the sensors and return the missile or aircraft to the target. Initially, Skinner secured funding from the Army to continue his research on the subject and to develop his innovative and exotic method of guidance, although some results did not accompany the Duck project, which was cancelled in October 1944, because policymakers believed that investing more time, money in that will delay that development of other projects whose success has been more promising. Later, the U.S. Navy studied the matter again, and a new set of tests began in 1948, but by 1953 the project was also cancelled due to major developments in electronics that became more accurate and ended any need for weapons directed to the bathroom. Bomb Bat. American plan to use bat to burn Japan from the sky. With the end of the Second World War on the European side and the fact that the United States is very close to Japanese territory on the Pacific front, the Americans were looking for effective ways to force the Japanese to surrender unconditionally without the need for land invasion. It was completely lacking in weapons and equipment and suffered great damage in its cities. It only required some strong attacks to do so. The basic design of the Bat's bomb was 3.5 meters long, according to the usual form of bombs, but instead of exploding, the bomb opened as it landed and hundreds of small bats began to spread everywhere searching for a dark place. Each bats are equipped with a small detonator that is supposed to explode after a specific time of opening the bomb, and with the bats spreading rapidly on a large area, there will be many small fires everywhere in the target area, and any of them may spread to a great fire. The Bat's bomb contained the napalm inside it, a flammable substance that is difficult to remove or extinguish as soon as it ignites, and the free-tailed Mexican bat, a small type of bat, was chosen for this task and experiments on targets began in the United States first. The first experiment caused a fire at a U.S. air base. The second experiment, which was modeled on a Japanese village, was very successful and authorized the start of the use of weapons. The weapon has never been used. Research on the nuclear bomb has shown fruit, and it has been decided to hit Japanese cities with nuclear weapons to force them to surrender quickly. Operation Downfall. A light plan for the Japanese invasion. The decision to bomb Japan's Hiroshima and Nagasaki cities was still highly controversial. Although the resolution was justified as the only way to subjugate the Japanese and force them to surrender and end the war quickly, some believe that the Japanese would have surrendered anyway without nuclear bombs originally, though the next paragraph will explain that this is completely wrong. In any case, the Americans had drawn up an alternative plan to force Japan to surrender if nuclear bombs were not used: the full invasion of the country. The plan was made up of two partial processes, the first called the Olympic, which was supposed to begin on November 1, 1945, and the occupation of Kyushu Island, the southern island of Japan, while the second part, called Coronades, perhaps to occupy the capital, Tokyo, and stabilize the presence of Allied forces in preparation for the expansion and occupation of the rest of Japan, relying on 50 sections of the U.S. military, in addition to the assistance of British forces. Of course, the invasion plan was never ideal. Estimates were that between 300,000 and 1 million were killed by invading U.S. troops. The Japanese had previously organized civil defense forces, and they were expected to organize civil defense, in this case, too, raising Japanese casualties to 10 million dead. Of course, the sheer number of Japanese deaths was logical and predictable, especially as the entry of Allies into Germany cost more than that. In any case, the process was not implemented at all because nuclear bombs were really dropped, and less than 10 days later Japan surrendered unconditionally. Operation Ketsugu. Japan's defense against the expected U.S. invasion. By 1945, the Japanese had lost most of their combat forces and their ability to fight even, and were no longer able to keep the war with the Americans over the waters of the Pacific, where it seemed clear that they would move to the Japanese territory sooner or later, and that the Japanese did not know about the nuclear bombs they were in the process of developing in the United States. They expected a total invasion from the landing similar to that of Normandy, which led the British and Americans to return to France and then arrive in Germany. Of course, the Japanese did not intend to stand idly by. They planned how to defend against this invasion. The name of this operation is Defense in Japanese, which was exactly what the Japanese were planning. They withdrew most of their forces from Korea and Manchuria, the northeastern part of present China, and began to deploy them in areas where Allies were expected to loot them to protect them to the limit. They also began to establish civilian combat battalions. These battalions included all healthy males aged 15 to 60, as well as all females between the ages of 17 and 40. Overall, this force had about 28 million people assigned to the invasion. In addition, the Japanese planned to use all the remaining aircraft, submarines and suicide boats in self-bombing attacks against the Allied forces in the Pacific to weaken them to the maximum. But although the Japanese manpower was really huge in terms of census, they were suffering from a very large shortage of fuel, equipment and weapons, although the plan took place as expected when the larger proportion of civilian fighters were to fight with primitive weapons such as spears made of wood and cane. In any case, the plan was never implemented. The nuclear attack left the Japanese with no choice but to surrender. Project America. The Nazi planned to bomb the United States using long-range aircraft. During the Second World War, the Nazis were obsessed with reaching American shores and bombing Americans in their countries. During the war, all countries suffered major damage and continued bombing while the United States kept the battles far from their territory. In contrast to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States and Japan, Americans have safely stayed away from the dangers of war, unlike their European and Asian counterparts. By 1942, there were 3 models under development for aircraft that could be used for this purpose. They were produced by 3 of the largest German carriers and armaments at the time, and with aircraft engines needing very large amounts of fuel at the time. The use of conventional designs was impossible, so the focus is on the jets that do not depend on engines, but take off using another aircraft drawn by the runway, and when they reach the appropriate height depend on the slide with the air currents as large birds in principle. The designed aircraft were very large and had very poor maneuvering capabilities, making them a difficult choice. With none of them showing promising results, the ambitious project was left to focus on missiles and other weapons. Later, the Nazis tried to carry out another plan to attack the Americans by carrying missile launchers on the Nazi submarines so that they could launch rockets at the American coastal cities. The project faced many obstacles and delays. By the end of the war, the factories and companies responsible for developing the project fell in the face of the Allied advance from the eastern and western fronts. Operation Felix. The Nazi attack on Gibraltar and the transformation of Spain into one of the Axis countries. After Germany succeeded in reaching France and the capital fell to Paris, Hitler soon turned to Britain as the second important enemy, which must be overcome to ensure a victory. But unlike France, which is connected to the mainland of Germany, Britain is on an island and has no land borders. The invasion and occupation are very difficult, especially with a very large naval force, so the alternative was to attack the British colony of Gibraltar. The colony on the strait of the same name has great strategic value, and its fall in the hands of the Germans could have been very useful. Of course, trying the naval attack on Gibraltar was very difficult with a strong garrison there and sea-oriented defenses and fortifications, but from the ground it is very different to the distant end, and the colony could fall quickly without one problem only. To get to Gibraltar, the Nazi forces must pass through Spain, which was completely neutral at the time, and allowing the Nazis to pass to attack a British colony was to be a clear bias of the Axis countries and makes both Americans, French and Soviets enemies. During the time, Spain was ruled by an iron fist by the famous dictator General Franco, and although he was not really different from the Axis countries in his policies and orientations, he came to power after a civil war that tore up Spain and weakened it to a great extent. They were communists at first. Messing with allies was not a good option to give the Soviets an opportunity to support them and create more internal problems. In the end, Franco's rejection of Hitler's and Mussolini's side of the war continued, and his neutrality in fact benefited him. He continued to rule Spain for more than 30 years. Habakkuk Project. Aircraft carrier made of ice. During the Second World War, the idea of ships carrying aircraft was not yet real. The planes needed long runways that were not enough for ships, and they had accuracy and guidance far worse than in the following eras, of course. But the absence of an aircraft carrier did not prevent a British inventor, Geoffrey Pike, of thinking of another type of aircraft carriers, relying on the idea that the ice floats on the water on the one hand and being positioned in place without melting. The plan was to the North Atlantic, where cold water currents allow the ice to remain solid in several months of the year. Pike created a miniature model made at Lake Patricia in Alberta, Canada. The model was 18 meters long and only 9 meters wide, but it was very expensive on one hand, in addition to weighing 1,000 tons. Unfortunately, the experiments on glacial ice-only surfaces were not successful. They were very easily destroyed by any nearby explosion that would break them down into small parts. They could not afford the weight of the planes or equipment and stores they were supposed to put on them for a fueling and fueling station for warplanes. Incidentally, two researchers at the Berkeley Technical Institute in New York have succeeded in finding that if wood or sawdust is mixed with water and frozen, it results in a material 14 times stronger than the actual ice and heavier concrete. This wonderful article was called Habakkuk after the word pike. Later, when compared with the original plan, it was found that the cost and the weight would be much greater than any real benefit that could be used. The wood was very scarce, so building only one Habakkuk would have affected the paper industry in a very negative way. 1943 all the former pike supporters had abandoned the project and were finally abolished. Operation Pike, a light plan to destroy Soviet oil fields. In 1939, with the beginning of tension on the European front of the great growth of the economic and military power of Germany, and a month before the German invasion of Poland, it happened unexpectedly where the Germans and the Soviets signed a non-aggression agreement so that neither party did fight the other or try to occupy its territory and damage his interests. This was a very big step for the French and the British. Apart from the fact that the war with the Nazis seemed inevitable, an agreement of this kind showed the possibility of their cooperation with another enemy of Western Europe, Communist Russia, especially as it contained secret clauses on the future divisions of Eastern Europe between the two powers. Of course, the agreement collapsed completely by 1941 with the Nazis' invasion of the Soviet Union after the Nazi domination of the western part of the continent. But in 1939 things were very different. For the French and Germans, a Soviet-Nazi alliance was a nightmare to be dealt with. The Soviets supplied oil fields in the Caucasus, destroying Soviet capabilities on the one hand, and preventing them from supplying the Nazis with the necessary fuel for wars, of course. The idea of an attack on the Soviet oil fields came back again in 1942 when the Nazis approached the Soviet Union and seized its oil fields. Operation Antikipel, a light plan to attack the Soviet Union. Before the Second World War, the relations between the eastern and western parts of Europe were very tense. While Western countries had capitalist economic systems and political systems based on democracy and elections for power, the East followed communism, which was the complete opposite of Western capitalism. Joseph Stalin, and iron grip on things, was clear evidence of the mechanism in which things will work there, with one party and one rule even if the faces changed, and although France, Britain and even the United States were in the same trench with the Soviets against the common enemy of Nazi Germany, the enemy never ended. With the demise of the common enemy of the Nazis, it is clear that Europe will suffer long years of tension at best and a Third World War at its worst. Soviets have taken control of the eastern part of the continent to East Germany, and their intentions towards global expansion have been very clear and frightening very much for other European countries. So the idea of waging war against the Soviets was an option in reality, but the claimants were not the Americans, but the famous British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Much of Churchill's desire to carry out this massive attack on the Soviets was based on US-developed nuclear bombs, and Japan bombed them, but the two bombs that bombed Japan were in fact the only ones at the time, and the Soviets could not have been bombarded with nuclear weapons. Barry was to be very expensive and almost imperfectly lost because of the great numerical and military superiority of the time. The failure to implement the plan led to the well-known Cold War scenario and decades of nuclear tension before East Germany collapsed and the Berlin Wall fell, followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. Plan, wrapper. The project of the US invasion of Brazil. During the Second World War, there were many neutral and non-war countries, especially the South American countries that did not take any of the Allies or Axis powers, but they had a greater tendency towards the Axis powers. Some of them, like Brazil and Argentina, were governed by fascist regimes. Although the position of Brazil was not inclined to the Nazis as much as the Argentine position, there are conspiracy theories that Hitler fled to Argentina and did not die in Germany. It was a very likely target of a defensive American invasion. For Americans, the most important factor in World War II was that they were being driven away from their land and across the Atlantic, and while they did affect American soldiers, of course, the general public was far from danger because of the absence of any outlets either for the Japanese or the Nazis in the western half of the globe. The Japanese and the Nazis had sympathizers and potential places to rely on to invade the continent, especially northern Brazil, and with the Americans wanting the Nazis as far away as possible, the project of invading Brazil and capturing its most important northern cities was put forward. The plan was first proposed in 1941, especially with the possibility of the Nazis reaching Brazil via Africa. The U.S. Navy was supposed to invade the northeastern cities of Brazil such as Fortaleza, Recife and Natal. The plan was never implemented, but the invasion plan was used as a pressure and intimidation card against the then Brazilian president. Under threat, he agreed to put American advisors in his air bases, and with U.S. support for arms, Brazil set its pro-ally stance by 1942. Operation FSS, Japan's plan to block and isolate Australia to force it to surrender. In 1941, the Japanese launched a Pearl Harbor attack on the United States, thus starting their war against the United States in the Pacific. Although Australia was not involved in the war at that time, being a former British colony and its strong relations with the United States and Britain made it a strategic place the Allies may be used to attack Japan and make big gains on it. So in 1942, the Japanese planned to try to end this threat permanently and isolate Australia from being a source of threat from Allies. The Japanese plan was called the FS, and although it was aimed at Australia, it did not include a direct invasion or attack on Australia. It was very costly and difficult to investigate, but included the occupation of the islands at Fiji, Samoa, New Caledonia, in the Pacific, and then imposed a blockade on Australia to force it to surrender or to ally itself with the Axis powers in a way that strengthens Japan's position in the Pacific. Later, the Japanese suffered a major loss in the Battle of Midway, and their freedom suffered a powerful blow that forced them to abandon the idea and focus on fighting the Americans instead. Operation Long Jump. The plot to assassinate the presidents of the United States and the Soviet Union and the British Prime Minister in Iran. According to the Soviet version, in 1943 the Nazis had spied on U.S. naval communications and broke their encryption to discover a very high-level meeting in Tehran between Stalin, the President of the Soviet Union, and President Roosevelt, as well as British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The Nazis proposed a plan to get rid of the three main Allied leaders at once by assassinating them in Tehran during the conference. According to the Soviets, the plan was approved by Hitler, and the secret police officer, Otto Skolzny, was appointed to do the job. In 1943, the Nazi team traveled from 6 Nazi spies to Iran. From there, the Soviets picked up their broadcasts to Germany and were arrested and thwarted. Stalin narrated events to Churchill and Roosevelt, is truly convinced of the story and questioned its credibility because of the absence of any non-Soviet source to confirm it. Later, after the fall of the Nazis and the end of the Second World War, an investigation was conducted with key figures in the German intelligence, including Skorzen himself, but they all denied the existence of such a plan originally, raising doubts about it.